Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today. And I'm really good at a lot of things about being a mom, but I am not good at keeping up with dates, like holidays, birthdays, things that my kids are gonna need stuff for. And so that's how these Easter baskets happened. I believe the conversation went something like, hey mom, there's an Easter egg hunt at our school tomorrow and I need a basket. So since I generally have fabric around, my last minute go-to for a lot of these types of requests is to sew something. And that's how I ended up with these Easter baskets. I made 2 of them, and one of the things I love is since we only use them once a year for a short amount of time, they're actually really easy to fold down and just kind of crush and store flat in a closet somewhere where they're not taking up a lot of room. In addition, if you leave the handle off, they can make excellent storage bins, like this yarn storage bin. Same idea, same way to sew it, I just didn't put the handle on the basket. So today I'm going to be showing you how to make this project with or without the handle. Let's take a look at the supplies to make these. You're going to want something round that you can use as a template. So I used this serving bowl and then just traced it onto a piece of paper, and that's how I got the round part of my pattern. You're going to want to cut one of interfacing, one of the outer fabric, and one of the lining fabric with this template. You're also going to want to mark the seam allowance on it. So in this case, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam, and I just use one of these old school compasses that you might remember from high school to mark my seam allowance on that. The reason you need to know the seam allowance: this inner circle has a smaller circumference than the outer circle. And you're going to be sewing on that seam allowance line, so that's the line you need to measure to figure out how big to make the outside of your basket. So take your measuring tape and mark a line or a point somewhere of where you're starting, and then take your measuring tape right along that seam allowance line that you've marked so that you can figure out the distance for the outer part of the fabric. Now take that number and add a seam allowance to it. So in my case here, I've cut this 7.5 inches wide, and then I've got it the distance to go around my circle plus a seam allowance to sew this rectangle into a loop. And just like the circle part, I cut this out of the lining fabric, the outer fabric, and some interfacing. I'm going to be fusing the interfacing to the back side of the outer fabric for the sides, the bottom, and for the strap. Now for the strap, I cut this 23 inches by 4 inches. And then I cut just the outer fabric and the interfacing. This part doesn't need to be lined. You can also skip this part if you're just making the basket and you don't want a handle on it. All right, let me go ahead and fuse the interfacing to all of these. And to do that, I'm just going to turn on my iron with no steam. Interfacing has like a shiny side where the glue is, so I will place that down on the wrong side of my fabric. And then when you're fusing interfacing, you want to make sure with your iron that you just go straight down, press, and pick straight up. Don't drag your iron back and forth like you might if you were ironing clothes, because you can create wrinkles in either the interfacing, the outer fabric, or both, and then you can fuse those wrinkles in, which is a problem. So straight down, straight up is your technique. Once you have your interfacing fused to the back side of those pieces, then we are going to work on the strap next. So again, if you're not going to add a strap to your basket, then go ahead and skip ahead in the video here. But what you want to do is fold this right sides together, match those long edges, and then we're just going to zip this through the sewing machine. Once you have sewn that seam, go ahead and turn this right side out and press. And once you have that turned right side out, go ahead and press it so that you've got a strap and so that the seam allowance is right on the edge. If you need some help with turning tubes quickly, I've got another video all about that, and I've got the link to that below. Once you have your strap pressed and turned right side out, we're going to top stitch it down both edges. And to top stitch, I like to move my needle as far to the right as it will go, as well as lengthen my stitch. So I'm using a 3.5 millimeter stitch, and I'm going to just zip down one side. And right on down the other side as well. Okay, so here's my finished strap. I'm going to set this aside for now because the next thing we need to do is take the outer part of this and sew it into a loop. So I'm going to fold it right sides together and stitch right down the short edge. And you can see that I've already done this with the lining fabric, which you do need to repeat this with the lining. The only difference is on the lining I'm going to leave a gap, and this is where I'm going to be able to turn the basket right side out. So you want to leave at least a 2-inch gap in the center of this seam on the lining. I've set those aside, and now we're going to work on the base of this. And here's where I'm going to get into the piping that I have. Now you can make your own piping, and in fact I have a video link below to exactly how to do that. But in this case I'm just going to use pre-purchased piping. And what I need to do is get this all around, basted to the bottom. So I'm going to use a lot of pins to do this, and I want the piping to go this way, and I want to be stitching right on that 1/4 inch seam allowance that I marked earlier. At the very beginning, I'm going to pull out a little of my piping, the cord that's inside. I'm going to cut that off and then pull the fabric, and what that does is it lets this part be flat so that I can overlap when I come back around. Okay, I'm going to take the piping, the flat edge, and I'm going to push it off the edge of the circle here, and then I'm going to overlap it and kind of look at where it overlaps, and that's about how much of the cord from the inside that I want to pull out. Now let's take this over to the machine and baste it in place. I'm going to switch my presser foot here for a zipper foot. And I personally like the narrow zipper foot, so that is the one that I'm going to use. Now that we've got that basted in place, I'm going to take out the pins here, and then I'm going to be stitching on the sides after we pin them. Before I pin the sides in, I'm going to add a couple little markers for myself. So I'm going to 1/4 this circle by folding it in half one way, and I'm just going to mark those halfway points with pins. And then I'm going to fold it in half the other way and do the same thing. I want to go ahead and mark the outside as well. So 1/4 mark for me will just be the seam allowance, and then I will do a mark opposite that, and then fold so that The seam allowance and that mark match up and make 2 other marks. Then as I start to pin, I want to match those marks to the marks on my circle. So I'm going to start with opening up this seam allowance and pinning that in place. Okay, once I have those quarter marks pinned, then I can start distributing the fabric between them. And what you're going to find is it's going to feel like you have extra fabric. You're going to use a lot of pins to get this all pinned in place, but once you do, here's what it will look like. And you'll notice that the fabric kind of looks wrinkly in between the pins. However, on the actual stitching line, there's not going to be a wrinkle. Those wrinkles are above it, and they'll go away once the pins are taken out. So use as many pins as you need, and then take this over to the machine to stitch. And because I am still stitching next to that piping, I like to keep my narrow zipper foot. But I do switch back from a basting stitch to a regular stitch length. Okay, once you've got that stitched, you can go ahead and turn it right side out. And look at that lovely round basket we've made. Let's go ahead and complete this. So the next step is going to be doing the same thing with the lining fabric and sewing another circular basket piece here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and it will actually be easier because I'm not working and fighting with that heavy interfacing. Okay, once you have sewn the lining together, just like the outer fabric, except for with that gap in the side seam there, we're going to leave this wrong side out and set it aside. Now on the actual basket, the outer fabric, you want to go ahead and baste piping all along the top edge with the piping facing down, and at the seam allowance you'll just overlap the same way we did on the bottom of the basket. Then we're going to pin the handle on if you are including a handle. So fold your basket in half. I actually like to then go and match those 2 points together so that my handle isn't overlapping the seam allowance. And then these 2 side points is where I will pin the handle. And to pin the handle on, you are just going to choose which side do you want out and put that right sides together with the basket and then center the handle at those 2 points. The next step is going to be to place the basket inside the lining so that we can sew around the top. So I like to start by matching up the seam allowances and then just pushing the rest of the basket into the lining. Now, I am actually going to remove the handle at this point because I'm not going to include a handle on this basket. But then you just go ahead and go around the top of the basket, matching up those raw edges. Once you have this all pinned, we're going to take it over to the machine to stitch. If you do not have a free arm machine, you can put it with your presser foot inside the circle to stitch. But I do have a free arm machine, so I am going to make use of that and stitch using that. And you want to make sure you're stitching right next to that piping. Once you've finished stitching around. Here's what it looks like, and now we get to turn it right side out. So reach in through that hole in the lining and do that. And then you'll push the lining inside of the basket. And the last thing we want to do is close up the lining hole with a ladder stitch. I've got a different video on how to sew that. That's a hand sewing stitch. That, and we're going to top stitch around by the piping. I'm going to move my needle to the other side this time and lengthen my stitch, and I want to sew right next to the piping. And there we go. You've got a storage basket that can also be an Easter basket if you added the handle.